This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. It's no secret that there is a very strong push from donors and policymakers that programming for development and humanitarian aid be evidence-based. This push has, to a large degree, driven the technology revolutions we're seeing in data collection and analytics, and it's also responsible for the more difficult conversations that are had around value for money. So what if you were in a position where you were responsible for both testing and building a viable path to scale for promising evidence-based interventions? This dream job is currently held by Karen Levy, our guest here on the 111th episode of the Terms of Reference podcast. Karen is the Director of Global Innovation at Evidence Action. She leads the organization's innovation strategy and oversees the Evidence Action Beta department that looks for new ideas and tests them to see if they'll work. I spoke with Karen in Nairobi. Hello, Karen. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for inviting me.
Where do we find you sitting today?
So I am here in Nairobi, where I've been based for a while, and that is where our regional office, Evidence Action's regional office, is located.
Fantastic. Well, I'm in Costa Rica, here in Nairobi, Kenya, and one of the things that I always found fascinating is that whenever I come to Kenya, people like to show me all of the banana trees and mangoes, and I have to be like, "Well, I'm sorry, we have those too," and it's a sad thing.
Indeed.
They all get really disappointed when they're so excited to show me stuff.
We don't have a total lock on the tropics here, but we're very proud.
No, but you have all the big land animals, right? So that's the difference.
That's true.
So you work for an organization called Evidence Action. Why don't we just start off by having you tell us about what is Evidence Action? Some of our listeners will know that Evidence Action kind of came out of or was conceived from one of the other organizations we talked about before. But maybe you can give us some background and tell us specifically about what you do.
Great. So Evidence Action is a relatively new organization, and our mission is to scale up programs that have been rigorously evaluated and that have been proven to be effective. And in doing so, our focus is really very specific. We want to scale up programs that work in reducing global poverty and that will affect millions or even tens of millions of people. And as you know, there's a lot of rigorous research on what works in reducing poverty. This often comes in the form of randomized evaluations. And there's an entire field of development economics that has been growing and maturing over the last 10 years that really tries to establish a causal relationship between an anti-poverty intervention and the actual impact that we seek to have on people. But what does this research then really mean for new and existing programs? This is a big question, and this is where Evidence Action comes in. What we try and do is bridge this gap between the important work that academic researchers are doing and what's actually implemented on the ground. We do this by trying to turn these promising interventions into actual scaled programs that are cost-effective, that have sound operations, and that can be scaled to millions of people. So I think the best example of this to start with, to kind of talk you through it, is to describe our two mature programs that we refer to as our flagships. And this is the Dispensers for Safe Water program and the Deworm the World initiative. Between these two programs, we will directly affect more than 220 million people this year. So you can see what I mean by scale. And we should also talk about our third department, which is called Evidence Action Beta, and I currently serve as the director of that team. And the Beta team tests a number of rigorously evaluated interventions to see whether they're suitable for scaling up.
So you said, that you're looking for rigorous answers to poverty. And the first thing that if someone who's not in the field is listening to this, maybe one of the first questions they say is, so is there an answer to poverty?
Oh, gosh, no. I think one of the things we've really learned is that there is no such thing as a silver bullet. But a lot of the work that's been done in the past doesn't really teach us a lot about what actually has an impact on the problems that we seek to address. So, for example, if you're, trying to improve some measure of health, there are a number of different ways that you can try and do that. But if you sort of do a pre-post evaluation, or if you just sort of ask people whether or not they think it worked, you may not get really solid answers about whether or not that particular approach was truly effective and effective compared to other possibilities. So I know you spoke to my friend and former colleague Annie Duflo recently, and this is where organizations like IPA, where many of Evidence Action's work was incubated, and the Poverty Action Lab and other similar organizations are generating that rigorous evidence. But Evidence Action really sort of picks up the story once that initial proof of concept is made. So, for example, the Dispensers for Safe Water program that I mentioned seeks to improve people's access to safe water. Okay, so I can tell you a little bit about that program. The Dispensers for Safe Water program is a proven and actually very innovative approach to increase the rates of chlorination in drinking water in the household. So again, this isn't solving every problem, but that's really a very, specific problem that people in rural poverty face. And we know that chlorine disinfects drinking water against most bacteria, including those that cause cholera, and at the same time protects that water from recontamination. So when you chlorinate water, you also don't have to boil it to disinfect it, and so that saves time and natural resources, et cetera, for mostly women in households that are responsible for this role. So the chlorine dispenser is installed in a community at the point of water collection. And it's fitted with a valve, and when you turn the valve, it delivers this precise 3 milliliter dose of chlorine. And so community members will go to the water source, they put their bucket or their jerry can under the dispenser, they turn the valve, and then they fill the bucket with water. And as they walk home, the chlorine mixes into the water and decontaminates it. So this program was shown in a series of randomized controlled trials and randomized evaluations that it really does work, okay, in a way that many other approaches to improving water quality may not. And so at Evidence Action, we are systematically scaling up that program, and we are currently reaching over 4.5 million people in Kenya, Uganda, and Malawi. And I think that program also provides some interesting examples of how we use rigorous measurement and, frankly, innovation in constantly making the program more effective over time.
The question that's sort of on the tip of my tongue, and again, I'm going to speak from maybe a development professional, aspect now is, does this, if you're coming and you're going to donors and saying, look, we actually have an answer. We know it works. We've got the evidence. Are you just crushing it when it comes to sort of getting continual funding and, being able to say, having donors come and be like, wow, we finally found an answer that totally works. Are you finding people are flocking to you, or is that still a constant struggle for someone or an organization that you've put the process together, right? You've got the evidence, you've got the results. How does that work? And I don't mean to sort of jump on, but we'll come back to your example.
No, it's a good question. And I wish it was so simple. On the one hand, I will say we have been very lucky in that, I think donors are interested in getting value for money, okay, in working with a partner who is, willing to sort of try and test things and, succeed or fail based on the evidence. But it's not quite as simple as we would like, in that an initial proof of concept from an initial set of studies, there's a huge gap between that and a successfully scaled, robust program that's, reliably delivering impact for millions. So, you may have a range of studies that are showing impact in a tightly controlled pilot-like phase, but there's a lot of elbow grease and artistry and, continued rigorous measurement and testing and pressure testing that goes into this process of bringing an idea from an initial concept to a fully fledged impactful program. And it is that space that we really exist in. And so we don't necessarily see ourselves as, always end-line implementers. And in many cases, that's, I wouldn't say a last resort, but wherever we can find partners, whether that's government, other implementers, market mechanisms to embed these programs in, we are very happy to be a catalyst and a facilitator for those processes. But when it's, value added for us to engage in implementation ourselves, then we'll do that. The dispenser program is a good example of, we've got a couple different versions. In Kenya and Uganda, we're doing most of the implementation directly, but in Malawi, we're working with the government, and their staff are providing some of the services that are necessary for delivering the program. So I think, funding what has been called this missing middle, the work that goes between initial proof of concept testing and just, course of business implementation at scale is a newer concept. And so far we're doing pretty well, but, there's always room to grow.
Do you find that you get pushback from some more of the traditional development organizations, or I'm thinking of the Save the Children's, the Chemonics, the DAIs, you name it. There's a lot of big organizations out there that have been doing this work for a long time. Aren't they banging the drum saying, hey, we've been doing this forever. There's nothing really different here. What's that fulcrum, that point of departure where you're saying, no, we've actually figured out a different way to do it?
I think that, some of the work that we do, some of the interventions that we explore are very complementary with some of the work that those other actors are undertaking. But I think that, as the field evolves and as donors and governments and, other stakeholders that aren't just putting money on the table are demanding results and are demanding cost effectiveness, that sort of lifts the tide for everyone. And I think, it's a healthy competition to, deliver value for money and to deliver impact. So, we see these different actors in the field not as competitors, but, as potential collaborators and as ways to learn about, how to work in various places. Okay. And, sometimes that's learning what doesn't work, but sometimes it's learning a lot of other valuable lessons as well.
I'm not trying to have anybody step on anybody else's toes here. I often think about that question, that I guess ultimately at the bottom of the line, even when you point out, look, the dispensers for safe water, the deworming, you said, you're going to affect 220 million people. There's more than enough work to go around. Unfortunately, there's more than enough work to go around. Why don't we circle back to that particular example that you wanted to provide after you were talking about the safe water dispensers?
Sure. Yeah. So this is, I think, a good example of how we think about using data and using evidence and innovating within a program to turn up the volume on the impact of that program. So part of the design of the dispensers for safe water program is that at each dispenser, there is a community volunteer that serves as a promoter. Their role is to educate their village about how to use the dispensers and to talk to people about why safe water is important for families. And we wanted to know whether it matters, and if so, how much it matters, whether a promoter is seen using the dispenser, him or herself. Because if that matters, then that's something that we can build into the program design. So our monitoring team that's based in Kenya tested that exact question in a little mini trial. We asked, is there an increase in people in a village using the dispensers if the promoter is seen using a dispenser? But it might be the counterfactual. It may be that it doesn't actually matter in terms of broader user adoption. And so this is a question that has immediate operational implications. So we had a very practical need to get a real answer. And so when we did a little test where we encouraged promoters in some places to be seen using the dispenser very publicly compared to other places where they were not, it turns out that it really does matter. It can increase user adoption by as much as 17%. So this now really has an effect on how we work with our team of promoters and, how they're trained, how they're motivated. And it's important also to note here that the way that we measured success here was by looking at the actual levels of chlorine content in people's water at home, not just by self-reported behavior, right? So, we wanted to make sure that we weren't getting a biased result. So that's an example of a little mini A/B test that's quite similar to types of A/B testing done in the for-profit sector as a matter of course that's helped us to, fine-tune and further focus the impact of that particular program.
I love that. I love that you just brought A/B testing into that. That's so fantastic. That more of that. And I don't mean to cut you off there again, but
no, go ahead.
Again, what I'm thinking of, so you saw a 17% increase. Now, when you're talking millions of people, that's a sizable chunk of people who could then be adopting it. Are there other examples that you would, or maybe you're going to put on the table here in our conversation, where it's a complete game changer, where the intervention was going one way and very little impact was happening, but then you either made one little tweak or you made a change and literally the universe changed?
So I think by the time a program makes it into our portfolio and we start thinking about it seriously, it's already undergone some initial randomized evaluations by one of our, partner organizations or by other practitioners. So we feel like there's a good reason to kind of, take a look at this program. But I think the school-based deworming approach, which forms the basis of our other flagship, might be an interesting example of this concept in general. So, as you know, intestinal worms are a problem faced by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. And it's such a common problem amongst children in particular that in many places it's just considered a symptom of childhood. It's not even considered like an acute problem that needs to be solved. And having chronic infection with intestinal worms makes children listless. It can affect it can give them anemia, their nutrition, is generally seen as a problem. But historically, the approach to dealing with this was more of a clinical approach, or perhaps through community deworming programs. So the Deworm the World initiative was founded based on rigorous evidence, again, from randomized evaluations that looked at the impact of school-based deworming and found that it had this tremendous results with respect to improving attendance in school and even based on follow-up studies on long-term outcomes for children. And so this was a really new way to think about building a scaled delivery platform using the education infrastructure to reach millions of kids. And so, that was an example of taking something that is a simple solution that had been out there for a long time. I mean, the deworming tablets are not a new medical intervention, but looking at, at a new delivery platform suddenly was a game changer in terms of thinking about how to deliver that program at scale. So we've been working with, for example, the Kenyan government for the last number of years, where they are now deworming with our support and technical assistance over 6 million children every year for free. And this is done through about 15,000 public and private primary schools. So again, embedded in existing infrastructure. And it's because of that program is so cost effective. It costs less than 50 cents per child per year, all in, fully loaded cost.
Wow, that's an impressive cost. That's amazing. Take us to Evidence Action Beta, which, this is your baby, so to speak, and I'm hoping
sure.
where you're most excited about. Like, what's the difference between the A/B tests, the tweaks, the rollout that you're doing in these other programs like the safe water dispensers, and what you do in the beta program?
So the types of A/B testing that I was describing earlier, that's an approach that we use to take existing mature programs that are already scaled and delivering impact and make them even better, even more impactful, even more cost-effective. The role of the beta team is, for lack of a better phrase, to find the next flagship. Okay, we are looking for new programs with the potential for impact and then moving them along this path to scale. So we borrow the term beta from the field of software development, where it refers to these products prior to commercial release that are still being tested to find any bugs. And that's what we see our role as. And we do sort of 3 types of activities on the beta team. So first, we're looking at identifying existing and emerging evidence of new ideas that have potential for impact. And so this is really about gathering and synthesizing and also prioritizing research, new programs that are being developed for which there's rigorous evidence that points to something that might actually work. But then we have to take those ideas and pressure test them. We have to ask questions about, this worked in a tightly controlled environment, but, would it work in the wild, so to speak? Is this something that's going to have legs when we make it grow? Is this something for which there's a viable business model? Is this something that partners are interested in working on? What would it actually look like to build a delivery platform for this? Who should be doing the delivery? All of the millions of questions that you need to ask, how can you standardize the delivery so that you can manage quality, so that you can maintain fidelity to the original study. You know, if you test one thing and it works, but then when you scale it up, you're actually doing another thing, well, maybe you're actually not achieving the impact that you think you should be. So this pressure testing process is very important to understand if things going to really hold water once it's big. And then there's a long process of building that path to scale, putting all of the pieces together, the partnerships, working with policy makers to make sure that any necessary policy and regulatory frameworks are in place to support a program like this, finding funding, bringing different partners together and, forging governance structures and agreements that allow them to work together effectively, building monitoring and evaluation strategies that are going to, again, make sure that you're maintaining that path towards impact. And so the hope is as we start to develop these programs in the beta department, we will be able to graduate some of them to full flagship status. And we're also cognizant that many of them will fail. And, we see our department almost as shaped like a funnel. We want to put a lot of things into the top, but we don't expect all of them to come out the bottom. And so learning how to exit from programs or make tough decisions about saying, well, this one, doesn't look like a winner. We should be focusing on other things. That's also a big part of what we do.
That you've just touched on a subject that I feel like is a gigantic white elephant in the room for many people in the humanitarian aid, international development world, saying no and being able to say, this actually doesn't work. Let's move on. You've been empowered to do that. How do you bring that to partners? How do you bring that to funders? How do you bring that, people have political agendas, people have policy agendas.
Sure.
How do you put that on the table and say,
tough. It's tough. I mean, there have been many times where I've, been in a room full of people working in development in different contexts, and I say, how many of you have ever written a report for a donor saying, thanks so much for these resources, tried it, didn't work, we're moving on, okay? And people look at me like I'm crazy, okay? I'm like, how could you do that? And so, I think that when we make value for money and not just, churn, not just burn rates, right? Not how many trainings can we run, well, then failure, when discussed openly, actually becomes valuable because you stop wasting money on it, right? And that's, in the for-profit world in Silicon Valley, people are proud of their failures, okay? And it's often what they'll talk about first. And so we try hard internally and in our partnerships to kind of put that out in front and be really honest with our implementing partners, with the donors that are supporting us, that investing in really knowing if something is working or not, or really seeing if something is viable at scale, is a good investment. A colleague of mine used to say, pilot programs never fail and never scale. And the development landscape is littered with pilot programs that are lovely to visit, but they will never be allowed to fail, but they will never scale. And we need to embrace those failures, and we need to systematically push ourselves to achieve scale as the goal. Poverty is a big problem. If we aren't doing things that have the potential to reach millions or tens of millions, then how are we going to work ourselves out of a job? How do we really confront these problems?
Is there a particular thing that you've discovered, or maybe you have a basket right now where you're like, you can go to a pilot, or you can receive one of these ideas that you're collecting to test, and right off the bat, you could say, nope, you know what? Boom, we know that this approach doesn't work. We've seen it 20 times. Full stop. Is there maybe one or two of those you could put on the table, or does that not exist yet?
Well, I would say that I am generally wary of programming that is overly holistic. When people are sort of trying to get at root causes, but in doing so are sort of putting 25 different spices in the soup. You may end up getting something that, again, works at a small scale, but it might be completely unviable to scale up. And if you are seeing impact from a program like that, how do you know which is the spice that makes the soup taste good, right? Because really what you want is to isolate, the things that are moving you furthest and fastest and scale those up. So the types of things that tend to work well at a large scale are generally things that don't require lots of personalization to every little tiny context, that are relatively simple, that can be done over a broad geography. And so, that's one thing that I look out for, okay? If a program has, 42 components, it just may never get large enough to, really have a big impact. So that's certainly one red flag. I would say another thing that I'm sort of wary of is programs where, even if you do them, there's no way to even know if it's having an impact. That may be valuable, but it's not what we're looking for, right? And, we are particularly interested in programs that we can subject to these rigorous tests. And so, again, that doesn't mean that it's not going to be a good fit for anyone, just may mean it's not a good fit for us.
I like that. My mind keeps going back to your references to Silicon Valley and maybe sort of, what people would say, internet entrepreneurs, these kinds of things, where there's a constant mantra of niche, try to, shave the question down to the absolute target consumer you're trying to find, the absolute, very, very simple problem you're trying to solve, and work on that. And then I personally preach this to many of our clients as well, is, solve one problem, solve it well, and, show that you can scale it, and then tack on another problem, or then tack on another service. But that's really interesting to hear somebody else talk about it that way.
I really agree. I think it's always a great opportunity when you have a program that's working well at scale. You can then layer other things on top, right? So building platforms, I think, can be a very valuable enterprise in and of itself.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the things that you're looking at right now? What's the next 5 years look like? What's coming up the pipe for you?
So I would love to tell you about one of the items in the data portfolio that I'm really excited about right now. And this is called No Lean Season. This is a program we're testing right now to see whether the initial evidence of impact holds true at scale. So the No Lean Season program seeks to reduce the effects of seasonality on the rural poor. What happens is, in rural areas, many rural families suffer from this seasonal income security and hunger in the period of time between planting and harvest. So in these situations, poor landless households are really, often in a position to struggle supporting themselves during this time period, even though at that very moment there are employment opportunities only a short distance away in nearby towns and cities. And so these households are often too poor to incur the financial costs of this seasonal migration. Going to a nearby bigger city where there's labor opportunities might be something that would really be helpful. You might be able to get a job as a bricklayer or a rickshaw driver. But the investment of just even a small amount of money for a bus ticket to go and try to get a job is too much of a risk. If it doesn't work out, it would just be catastrophic. So this program, No Lean Season, reduces this risk by providing households with a small loan to cover the cost of transport. It's basically the cost of a bus ticket to get to a nearby larger labor market during this lean season to try and find work. And so what we've seen in research that has looked at this program, it's been led by a professor named Mushfiq Mubarak at Yale University, is that offering this small one-time subsidy encourages this migration. So it actually does induce additional migration above the baseline level that we sort of just generally see in these villages. And that when that happens, there is an increase in food consumption of a number of calories that's equivalent to an additional meal a day every day for every member of the household. So this is a huge impact for what is really a very, very small investment, in the order of, $15. And we're also really excited to see that some of this impact seems to persist over time. So people who receive the subsidy this year are more likely to actually migrate again in future years, even when they're not given additional loans or, grants in the future. So it seems like this program confers like an experiential good, connections with employers, going and giving it a try and seeing that it works. And this seems to benefit people beyond just this initial investment. And, we're excited about this because it may be a really terrific example of sustainability, which is, something that we know is so elusive. It's this magic word that's so elusive in our line of work. An example of a one-time investment that seems to have knock-on effects over time. So the initial results are really promising, and we are working with a partner in the Rangpur region in Bangladesh called RDRS, which is mostly a microfinance organization, although they have some other programs as well. And we are currently working with them to design a scalable version of this program. In other words, a version that could be implemented in hundreds and thousands of villages, not in a research setting, but in a programmatic setting. But we're going to do a couple more rounds of testing to make sure that the initial promise that we saw in the initial studies are maintained when it's done at scale. And to come back to, your earlier question about how this fits into the broader landscape, this isn't a magic bullet. This is not going to solve all of the problems that, poor rural families in these areas face. But it might be a really good complement to food aid, which is not necessarily it's a very important thing to do in a humanitarian context, but it's not always the most leveraged approach. So in combination, that might be very, very powerful. So we just announced this partnership. We're in the first year, and we hope that if all goes well, over the next 4 years, we'll be, serving a few 100,000 families in that region through this program. We also have some initial studies that show that this may also work in Indonesia, and we're looking at some other geographies as well. So that's, I think, an example of a program where initial proof of concept, very, very promising, but, a long path to be trod before we are in a world where this is something that's just business as usual and is a service that's provided, and that would be like a steady state scaled program. And so that's the journey that we're taking right now.
Fantastic story. I love it. My mind wanders to who's given you the rope to do this? Is this a pool of funds that Evidence Action sort of keeps around and says, look, this is going to go to our beta program, and we know that this is our investment fund, this is our slush fund, and if it fails, it fails. If it's great, then we leverage it and move it there? Or is your department responsible for going out and finding donors or finding other mechanisms? I know in this particular case, you're working with a microfinance institution, so maybe they've got, maybe they're kicking in the money. How does that funding mechanism work for, what we're looking for, patient capital, for capital that's okay to fail?
Right. So, I think we tend to attract a certain type of donor that's interested in proven impact. Okay, so we get a lot of people who are interested in funding innovation, in funding, proof of concept work. We also get a lot of support from the effective altruism movement. This is a really important source of funding because it's a group of people that really cares about maximizing the impact for every dollar that they donate. We do have a range of institutional donors, of foundations that support our work. I would say that, one of the relationships that we're most proud of is the one that we have with GiveWell. And so as you may know, GiveWell is an organization that they themselves rigorously evaluate the cost effectiveness and the impact of different programs and different organizations, and then they publish a set of recommendations about where individuals should donate their money. Right now, our Deworm the World initiative is currently on their list of the most effective charities to donate to globally. We're certainly really proud of that. And they have also recently reviewed this No Lean Season program that's part of our beta portfolio. And based on that initial positive review, we received some support from Good Ventures, which is a funder that's interested in evidence and in scale. So, we're, as I said, a young organization. We certainly, have ambitions greater than our current pool of funding. But we've gotten a great response from donors that really care about scaling evidence-based work. The Global Innovation Fund, that's relatively new. We've got some great conversations and some existing relationships working with them. Development Innovation Ventures within USAID. As I said, GiveWell. I think there is a groundswell within the development funder space to invest in work like this. And, of course, we certainly want to encourage that.
Mm-hmm. You have talked about, over the course of our conversation thus far, safe water dispensers, deworming. Now we were just sort of leveraging microfinance or a loan type of mechanism to help people. These are all fairly tried and true or stalwarts, within the development business. Is there anything that you have out there or that you've seen coming across your desk that's a true disruptor, that somebody's coming out and said, hey, I've developed this new powder that turns people into superhumans or something like that, or are you finding it's still the fundamentals and we're tweaking how we deliver them?
So I think I have two answers to that question. I mean, I think in some ways the real innovations are very boring. New toys.
I love that.
I
love that you just said innovation is boring. That is so cool. Yes, I agree. Go ahead.
But in some ways it should be, right? I mean, a new shiny gadget is really exciting until you discover how difficult it is to get 10 million people to use that gadget, right? And it's that growth path, okay? And the stability, the business as usual that we're looking for in programs. Sadly, that is innovative in this space. Okay, there are far too few examples of really evidence-based programs that are truly scaled. Okay, really reaching millions or tens of millions. If you look at the history of development work, there aren't that many examples. Oral rehydration salts, vaccines, right? They had this one shining moment of innovation, but from that moment on, really what mattered was scaling them up, okay, making them part of the normal course of doing business. So, my first answer to your question is that, everything we do, we feel at Evidence Action, the very premise of our approach and our processes are cutting edge and innovative if you look at them in the context of the global development field. But I would also say there are lots of interesting new things, and I'm always keeping an eye on what's new research that's coming out. I pay very close attention to research coming out of IPA, JPAL, SIGA, other similar organizations. We are in many ways the most eager consumer of their research. We couldn't do what we do without it. They provide that critical initial proof of concept that serves as the foundation for our work and the work of so many others. I'm very excited to see what happens with this new universal basic income study that GiveDirectly is going to be doing here in Kenya. Generally speaking, I'm a big fan of GiveDirectly and the work that they do. I think it serves as a really terrific benchmark that we all need to judge ourselves against. If you can't do better than just giving the money away, then just give the money away. So I'm certainly cheering them on and I'm very eager to see what happens in that study. That's going to be many years down the road, but I think it's going to be, potentially really game-changing.
My next question, I think, might be the corollary, might be the other side of the coin to the one that I just asked, but what are the biggest barriers for you? What is the wall that you run into on a regular basis? What's your biggest frustration when you're cutting edge, you're an innovator, you want to see these new things come to life? Is there one or two walls that you are finding you're constantly climbing or a difficult conversation to have?
Sure. I think saying no to things is hard. Both, being selective about what we take on, but then also, taking things out of the pipeline when they're not looking promising. We all pour our hearts into this work, right? And, you want the work that you do to make a difference. But if you really put that, hat on of rigor and objectivity, there's a natural tension there. And so, it can be hard to say, look, we gave this one a good shot, but we're going to take it out of the portfolio. So that's certainly a barrier, and making sure that people understand up front that can happen. That's certainly a challenge. And I do think that, while we have met with, success in raising resources and, are very, very grateful for the support that we have, this kind of missing middle can be a challenge, right? There's always interest in funding that basic research, those initial sparks. And then there's also interest in, funding sure things, right? Once something is scaled and operating well. But that messy middle bit where things need to be de-risked, they need to be tested. There's a lot of work that needs to happen in there that's kind of inherently messy. And so, that can be a challenge. So, it's definitely not always a straightforward path, but, certainly one that we're excited to keep trying again.
Two more questions for you. Two questions I try to ask every single person on the show going forward here. You've mentioned a lot of people that you pay attention to, JPAL, CETA, Give Directly, et cetera, et cetera. Is there anybody else that you'd put on that list about people that you pay attention to? And I'm thinking blogs that you read or podcasts you listen to, obviously other than this one, or just sort of sources of cutting edge information that inspire you and maybe inform what you do?
Sure. So, I think that the work that David Evans at the World Bank does in talking about randomized evaluations, in summarizing and critiquing and synthesizing the huge pipeline of research that comes out is just invaluable. If there's a new post from him, I will read it immediately. Some of his other colleagues at the bank, I think, are also doing some really exciting things. Some of the bloggers, people who write blogs at CGD, the Center for Global Development, I think similarly are doing some very interesting work. I was excited to read recently about the work that Amanda Glassman and her colleagues are doing with Millions Saved, looking at programs that are achieving scale. I'm also really excited about a new partner that we're working with. They're not new, but our partnership is, and this is an organization called IRD in Pakistan. And they are doing some really exciting work that we're partnering with them on incentives for immunization. So, besides being just a really spectacular organization in general, I think this is something that's really innovative. And, they're building this platform that uses RFID tags placed on immunization cards to build an online digital immunization registry. So, they're a really forward-thinking organization, and that's a new partnership that we're developing and hope will expand in a lot of exciting ways.
So now, is there a person or an innovation or something that's completely outside of your purview, something that you wouldn't work on, something that you wouldn't necessarily be able to touch as a part of Evidence Action or part of the beta program that you think is just super cool? Is it a drone? Is it a new gadget? Is it something that's really, really boring? Something that you could tell us that you're like, wow, I think that's really cool.
So I think I would actually come back to this universal basic income program that Give Directly is doing. Giving out money, unconditional cash transfers to poor people is such a simple idea, but it's such a revolutionary one. And so, that is, quite outside of the work that we do in terms of looking for particular interventions that seek to improve particular health or development outcomes. But, that's, as I say, potentially really a game changer, and I'm very excited to see where it goes.
Karen, thank you so very much for being on the show today. This has been a fantastic conversation. I wish you all the best.
Thanks. It's been really fun.
You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from Aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.